So this is the fourth lecture in Anthropology 202, Human Evolution. And we are going to begin a new module by looking at a different set of evidence. So we were looking at contemporary evidence of human evolution. And now we're going to begin to look at evidence from the past. So a different kind of evidence for human evolution. We're going to look at the evidence that comes from archaeology and the evidence of human culture or behavior, learned and shared behavior, and that can include what we eat, right, our subsistence strategies, our economic systems. It can include how we relate with one another. It can include how we think about the world. All of that being learned and shared behavior. Well, there's a great deal of evidence for its evolution through time. That is, there is a lot of evidence for the fact that human behavior today is unlike human behavior in the past. How humans live today is different than how humans lived in the past. And so this is the particular topic for this unit, and we're going to proceed accordingly. Now, we talked about genetics and we talked about primates and their morphology and behavior and their scientific classification. And so when we turn to looking at archaeological evidence, it's important to think a little bit about what that means. So archaeologists recover remains, human remains like fossils, organisms that have become rock through time. We're going to talk more about fossils in the course, but it is time to introduce the idea of human remains, remains that are preserved from the past. This is an important form of evidence for human evolution. And then for this particular unit, the idea of artifacts, human artifacts, objects that were made by humans that also are preserved and provide information about past humans and past human behavior. Now, both fossils and artifacts can be dated, and we date them and we interpret them to make sense of sort of what humans were like in the past, what humans did in the past, what humans thought in the past, and so on. And it's clear from these human remains, from the fossils that we have of past humans, from the artifacts, from the material culture that they produced, that there's been a huge change in humanity over that kind of deep time that we've been talking about in this course. And I think one of the valuable ways to think about this is to focus on maybe one of the big cultural changes that occurred in human evolution. And we focus on this particular cultural change because it is so important that humans were so different before this cultural change and after this cultural change. We can see that in the archaeological record. We can see this change in both the fossils and the human remains on the one side, right, as well as in the artifacts on the other. And so in terms of the time, kind of we want to be thinking now, because of the deep time, we want to be thinking about what is known as geological time, rather than, let's say, the normal time frames that we are accustomed to. And there are two that are really important here. And in fact, the moments or the epochs of geological time, in fact, parallel that of the shift and change in human cultural behavior. And so the epochs of geological time to be familiar with here are, on the one hand, the Pleistocene, and on the other hand, the Holocene. So the Holocene is a period of geologic time that we are in right now. In fact, there are some debates related to issues of climate change and global warming that argue that we're actually in what is called an Anthropocene. a new period of time where human being and human activity becomes a geological force and a determining factor in a new Earth climate. So there's the Holocene, right? And then there's this geological period of time before the Holocene known as the Pleistocene. And in popular culture, the Pleistocene is sort of known as the period of the ice ages. And the Pleistocene is known in the popular culture as the Stone Age, the age of cave humans, cave people, and so on. And so you probably have encountered some of that imagery of the kind of popular understandings of the Pleistocene, a period of time where the Earth's climate was very different. The plants that were on the Earth varied from what we see today. And the fauna or the wildlife that existed on the planet was different than it exists today. So you see here, for example, the woolly mammoth, an important species that was very widespread, very dominant during the ice ages, but which is no longer, that's gone extinct today. And so this period of the Pleistocene change into the Holocene is simultaneous, right, with this big change in human cultural behavior. And we can think about the Pleistocene going back about 3 million years. So deep time, once again, we've been talking about this and why we brought up the concept of deep time. And its importance, right, is because now we're talking about really different climates and different plants and animals and so on. And so that's the sense of deep time. The Earth is truly different at that moment. Now, there are Homo sapiens at the end of the Pleistocene and into the Holocene. We have in the archaeological record the presence of remains of Homo sapiens. We have evidence, artifacts, right, of the presence of Homo sapiens. And we have that through into the Holocene, really the 20 to 10,000 years. You don't just sort of, these geological time epochs don't end sort of at the drop of a dime. They are a kind of it's an unfolding of a kind of a massive, really environmental and climatic set of changes that's occurring. And so it's over also, as you can see here, thousands of years, right, that this Pleistocene period came to an end. But now with the end of those ice ages, and so in the, as many people, maybe particularly in this area of the world, the northeastern United States, is familiar, we had at the height of the ice ages, we had ice that would have been pretty much from the Arctic all the way down here to Spokane. So that would be all really of Canada as we know it today would have been covered under ice. And there was the large lake that was blocked by glacial ice that during the warming period, this ice lake drained and created a lot of the geological formations that we have here in eastern Washington. So this may be something that you're familiar with, that kind of period of the late Pleistocene into the Holocene. And so during that period of time, we're having this warming that's occurring. We have this retreat of the ice, and we have a general warming on the Earth that had not, the temperatures had not been that high in previous geological, immediately previous geological periods. And so you have the end of what we see in terms of human artifacts, the end of what is known as the Old Stone Age, and the beginning of what is known as the New Stone Age, the Neolithic period, lithic being a term for stone tools, before the beginning of the knowledge of metal making for humans. Humans didn't use metal for any kind of tools, and we don't see any artifacts related to metal. And it's at this shift to a warmer climate, to a new Earth climate, that we actually see a shift occurring in terms of the stone tools that humans are making. That actually the tools are more refined, and we see that they become associated with a new subsistence strategy. This subsistence strategy changes so much of what we know of human learned behavior. And the effects of this can't be sort of overestimated, really. In fact, they have important impacts on human biological form. And we see this particularly from the form that Homo sapiens have from 200 to 300,000 years ago. So, back into the Pleistocene, the human morphology, just like the human behavior of that period was different, the human morphology was different as well. And with this change that came out of the Holocene, particularly roughly around 10,000 years before present, so to kind of put that in lay terms, if we think about we're in the year 2021, 10,000 years before present takes us to the year 0. So what religious Christians would say was the time, right, of Jesus Christ. That's 2,000 years ago. So we need another 8,000 years. So at another 8,000 years, right, you're getting before the major civilizational artifacts that we think of for humans, such as the pyramids, right? We're before that period of time when there is nothing like that on Earth. There are no cities on Earth at that 10,000 years before present. Or if we go back, let's say, to 20,000 years before present, there are no cities. But with the shift to the Holocene and moving up to the year or the number 10,000 years before present, there is something very big that happens in the archaeological record. The human remains of humans change dramatically, and the artifacts in association with humans change as well. So what do we see? Well, we see the beginnings of what is domestication and the development of agriculture. So at the beginnings of the Holocene, with climatic changes, we see new sort of human behavioral adaptations that occurred. We see in what is known as the Fertile Crescent, that's the area between the Eastern Mediterranean, what we think of today as Israel and Syria and Lebanon, up into Turkey, and then across, right, what is known as Mesopotamia, places like Iraq today. This Fertile Crescent area is where we see a very big change in the archaeological record. That is, we see in that area, in this time period, something new. Whereas before that, we had the older stone tools and humans using wild plants and animals, and depending upon a set of behaviors for their subsistence. We see a new technology, the new stone tools, and we begin to see them using domesticated varieties of plants and animals. This is the development of agriculture, where rather than following wildlife and following wild foods in the landscape, humans begin to settle and begin to plant, begin to maintain, and begin to harvest wild plants as well as wild animals in settled residences. So, if you think about today, some of the things that we associate with humans' behavior, we think of the cities, right? And we think of the development of civilizations in terms of the kinds of behavior associated with agriculture and with a settled life. And that really comes out of a rather late development for our species. So our species lived in an old stone tool technology and lived in a non-agricultural existence for the far majority of the period of its evolution. So most of the archaeological record of Homo sapiens or human beings is them without agriculture. Again, in living on an earth, right, where there are no cities, where all human populations are foragers rather than farmers. And that's really significant in many ways, so much more than a single lecture really can capture. But if we're exploring human evolution, we're exploring the evidence for human evolution, this is one of the places to begin when we start thinking about the human past. Not just thinking about our genetics today, not just thinking about our anatomical or morphological relations to other primates, our behavioral connection with other primates, but it's begin, right, to think about not just right in this moment, but in the past. And very quickly, we, in the archaeological record, can see humans living in ways that's very similar to our chimpanzee relatives in the primate world. Because chimpanzees today are tool users, and they would fall within what we would call closer to the older stone tool technologies, and they are foragers, omnivorous foragers, depending on wild plants and animals. And we have lots of evidence. We have actually the bulk of the evidence for Homo sapiens would be that precise kind of behavior. With the development of agriculture and the use of domesticated plants and animals, we have what is called exponential human population growth. So when we were saying during the late Pleistocene period, there were already Homo sapiens evolved. Their numbers on the earth were very, very low. So there are lots of areas where we don't see evidence of their presence. We estimate the total population for human beings on Earth would have been less than 10 million. So today, the United States itself has some 330 million people. But at the late Pleistocene on the Earth, we would have had no more than 10 million human beings everywhere over the Earth's surface. So the Earth's surface looked different, and human beings looked different in the sense just that we're talking about here. Their groups were very small. So in the photograph here, you have one of the first human cities or human fixed settlements where humans are living off of domesticated plants and animals. And this is in Turkey, in a site known as Çatalhöyük. And Çatalhöyük, this site, very important in all human history. It's important for Turkish people, for their national history and its cultural heritage. But it's also a World Heritage Site. It's recognized by the United Nations because it's a site that's valuable for all human beings to understand themselves. It was a site where it's one of the first cities in this fertile crescent. There are no other cities in the world outside of that fertile crescent. And this is before the development of the pyramids and the large civilizations that we think of for our ancient world, that we do sometimes explore: ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, right? Ancient Mesopotamia. This is the beginnings of human civilization, where people begin to prepare new kinds of foods based on domesticated plants and animals. They're living in larger groups, so people would estimate at any time we had between 3,000 and 8,000 people all living in one place. And we had never seen that in the archaeological record before the beginning of the Holocene. It was like with that climatic change and the environmental changes that were happening, it required humans to shift their strategies. And the way that the subsistence strategies shifted was to domesticated plants and animals, encouraging the growth of particular plants, encouraging the growth of particular kinds of animals. And this really did change the way humans saw themselves. It changed the way that they interacted with one another. It changes the technologies that they developed. And the chapter discusses this. It's very important in anthropology, but we begin to have the first real evidence of mass conflict or mass violence. So that once humans' population begin to grow and human populations become attached to fixed resources and fixed localities, we begin to see the evidence of one community waging violence against another. Now, there's personalistic violence that we have evidence of that previous, but we don't have organized violence by one group of humans against another group of humans previous to this period. We don't really have the development of weaponry and its use against humans. We don't see that in the archaeological record prior to this period. So there's a tremendous change in human beings that occurs. And it is used, the evidence, the artifacts and the remains are used to illustrate, right, the fact that, not only do we have the genetic evidence, we have the evidence within the primate phylum, but we also have evidence of cultural evolution within human beings or within Homo sapiens themselves, that they themselves have changed through time. While we have it at the level of the artifacts, what humans are doing and so on, we also talked about just the impact on human morphology. And it's really important that this change of the Holocene, the environmental conditions that changed, and the way that humans behaved in interaction with that environment, leading to new adaptations that are behavioral, it also led to adaptations that were morphological, were anatomical. So we have an expression in English, you are what you eat. And this is actually a really accurate statement because when humans changed from eating wild foods, wild plants, and wild meats, wild animals, and they began to depend upon wild meats, but in particular with the development of agriculture, with the dependence on grains, on the dependence on carbohydrates in the diet, this is really big for human morphology. We see lots of changes that the human body undergoes after the development of agriculture. And it's often referred to as this masticatory functional hypothesis, in that the foods that were consumed by foraging human beings tended to be tougher, rougher, and harder than those foods that were eaten by human beings after the development of agriculture. The foods that were cooked more, the grains, right, that were made into mushes and things like this. What this did was decrease our need for the skeletal anatomy in things like the skull and the jaw. So we can see the decrease in the size of the skull and jaw among Homo sapiens from about 10,000 years and after. We begin to see the increase in caries. So one of the things in human populations before the development of agriculture, we really don't see the evidence of cavities, right? Dental caries. But this is something that we see after the development of agriculture. We begin to see what is called in biological anthropology the gracilization, the thinning and decline of bone strength in human beings, the beginnings of osteoporosis, and really just a decline in bone strength. We begin to see, because human beings are living very closely, we begin to see the impact of infectious disease on human populations. Human populations begin to be infected by bacteria, infected by virus that we didn't see in the archaeological record previously. And so what you see here in the slide is an early Pleistocene hominid skull. So this is human-like. Its exact relationship to human beings is currently being debated. But notice the jaw. Notice the amount of skeletal material underneath the front teeth. Notice the mandible as it goes up to the skull cap itself. Notice the significance of those brow ridges there, which held the muscles that were coming down for the grinding processes, right, of the wild kinds of foods and seeds and tubers and things like that. This is ultimately what we're going to see transformed, right, by these broader behavioral changes in our species. So to kind of conclude, we don't have just genetics, we don't just have our understanding of contemporary primates today as evidence for human evolution. Archaeology gives us also great evidence for both anatomical but also behavioral changes. Probably one of the biggest is the development of agriculture, and probably one of the biggest topics in the field of anthropology and the development of archaeology. We see within many different sites within the Fertile Crescent, I referred to the Satohayuk, clear changes through time in human remains and artifacts.